Hello, everyone. My name is Sharon Roberson. I'm the president and CEO of the YWCA Nashville and Middle Tennessee. Welcome to this month's Stand Against Injustice Lunch and Learn. It's entitled Black Nashville Then and Now. I think it's very important for us to understand that this is Black History Month. It's very important for those that are on this call to understand that we are talking about an issue that is nothing new. However, we are looking at a micro view of something that is a macro issue. And the things we'll talk about today on this panel are things that have happened all across this country. When I was looking at this title, there are so many different aspects of the Black experience in this country. I really started looking at, being a lawyer, I started looking at different laws because the Black community has been marginalized economically, politically, and socially since we were brought over on slave ships. And I started looking at how could this be? I looked at the number of laws, the constitutional amendments, the major civil rights acts going back to the, literally the 1800s. That were supposed to remedy situations that, if you look at it in light of the ideals of this country, that all people are created equal. It didn't say whether you're European or not, but we knew that people were looking at trying to get away from the British. They were talking about the fundamental rights of liberty, free speech, freedom of religion, due process law, and freedom of assembly. And when all of these issues exist, but yet we have page after page of civil rights acts, of 14th Amendment, 13th Amendment, First Reconstruction Act, Second Reconstruction, there are just a litany of laws that have passed. And if you look at the Constitution, it makes you wonder, why did we need these laws if in fact the foundation of this country was set up to provide all of these freedoms? So this is really just an illustration of how we have failed as a country to really make sure that all people had access to the rights that were established as the country was founded. So thank you very much for everyone for being here. We have a phenomenal panel, and each one of these individuals is an expert and leader in their field. We're going to start with each individual introducing themselves. And as they introduce themselves, they will tell you a little bit about how they relate to looking at Black Nashville then and now. I'll start with someone that I admire so much, Dr. Sekou Franklin.
Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate it. President Roberson, I want to thank you and your team, Stephen Watts, Michelle Mowry, and also the esteemed panelists as well. Thank you for having me here. And again, my name is Dr. Sekou Franklin. I live here in Nashville, Davidson County. I spent about 19 years in North Nashville and recently moved, but that's kind of been my home base. I work in Murfreesboro, Rutherford County, so I split time between both areas, and have had a history of working with a lot of grassroots organizations, ranging from environmental issues, economic justice, racial justice, and also the Tennessee State Conference as well of the NAACP, and have also wrote about Nashville with the report with the Urban League a decade or so ago, and then more recently wrote about Tennessee, including Nashville, in a book that was co-authored with Dr. Ray Block out of Penn State University. So thanks for having me.
Right. Thank you so much for being here. Ms. Brigette Jones.
Thank you so much for having me as well. I am the Director of Equitable Partnerships for Belle, Meade Historic Site and Winery. My historic focus is enslavement and the generational impact of American chattel slavery. I spend most of my time focusing on what that looks like for Tennesseans. I'm native to Memphis and have been in Nashville since 2009. I came here as a freshman at Tennessee State University, which is where I hold my degree from. So I'm very proud to be a young historian in this field and being able to tell the stories for people who were not able to fully speak for themselves at a point in time. So I'm a proud descendant of the enslaved and grandchild and daughter of laborers.
Thank you. Ms. Linda Wynn.
Thank you for having me. I am a native Nashvilleian, and so I've been here all of my life. I'm the Assistant Director for State Programs with the Tennessee Historical Commission, and a former professor of history at Fisk University, where I taught courses in civil rights, from women in the civil rights movement to civil rights through film, African-American history, and intro to public administration. My degrees are from Tennessee State University, although the last degree I started out at the University of Tennessee, Nashville. And as you may be familiar with the case that Avon Williams brought against UT Nashville, Tennessee State ended up taking in the University of Tennessee. So that's how all of my degrees ended up being from Tennessee State University. I'm a proud alumna of Tennessee State University, and my areas of interest are primarily civil rights and women's history and Tennessee history.
All right, thank you. And as we get started, I would be remiss if I didn't thank the Nissan Foundation. They make this webinar possible. This is a conversation that fortunately those in our community feel like they should invest in, because we have to build a consciousness of legacies of discrimination and oppression, which exist and need to be acknowledged. We're going to get to the questioning. And as I go through this process, sometimes I do relate to stories that I've experienced and things that I've experienced. But let's start off, as scholars of social movements, what do you see as the relationship, key similarities and differences between the civil rights movement and the Black Lives Matter movement? I'll start with you, Dr. Franklin.
Okay. Well, hopefully I won't talk too long, but
Take your time.
there's a direct line between the civil rights movement, or what some may refer to as a freedom movement, or the Black freedom movement, however you want to describe that, and the Black Lives Matter movement. On the issue of policing and state violence, on that particular issue, one of the concerns that came out of the movement of the 1950s, 60s, and even before, and you can even go back to looking at some of the literature coming out of the 19th century, some of the work coming out of the Harlem Renaissance, was state violence and police violence. And it's one of the under appreciated aspects of, let's focus on the movement of the 50s and 60s, and even in Nashville, that movement activists were concerned not just about dealing with voter disenfranchisement and de jure or legal segregation, but they also reached into issues of Head Start, issues of supporting Medicaid, supporting the creation of Medicare, but also in dealing with police violence, state violence, and those kinds of things. And just a few examples nationally, then one locally. That nationally, people like Martin Luther King Jr. went to Harlem in '64, Chicago in 1966, Watts in 1965. In Harlem and in Chicago, he was pushing for example, community oversight or civilian review board. As an example, in Nashville, the leaders of the Nashville movement actually produced a document of civil rights demands, some of which included reforming the police department, which was broadly defined. It could include hiring more officers or dealing with more structural or systemic issues as well. And even inside of the police departments in places like Chicago, you had the African American Patrolman League and other things like that. The research just shows that a lot of the protests coming out of the 1960s focused on police violence, state violence, and related vigilante violence. And that's the direct line to the BLM. The Kerner Commission produced a report in '67 in response to those uprisings of 1967. A subtext of that Kerner Commission report was a team of researchers went out and interviewed Black folks in 10 cities. And in those interviews, Black folks are talking about the need for bail reform, autonomous institutions, issues that align today with, ironically, some of the movement for Black Lives Matter work and stuff like that. Where I think the Black Lives Matter folks differ in many respects is their real emphasis, at least at the height of the BLM movement, particularly between 2014 and 2020, is their emphasis on what I call democratic pluralism in the Black community. That is, that their emphasis on saying that all Black lives matter, not just suit and tie wearing professors like myself, but poor Black folks, those Black folks that experience secondary marginalization, those Blacks that are marginalized and dismissed, young people, women, transgender folks, that it's not just that one Black life matters, but all Black lives matters. And so they're challenging conversation. They're challenging white supremacy, they're challenging state violence, but they're also challenging the internal politics dynamics of the Black community that may be shaped by race, by class, or by social status as well. So that's where I think the Black Lives Matter may be different, at least accentuating the differences between the movements of the past and the movements of the present.
Ms. Jones, same question. The similarities and differences between the civil rights movement and Black Lives Matter, realizing that these things have been going on for decades in one form or another.
Absolutely. I like to look at the social climate at the time. So looking at the impact of racism and economic inequality on the actual people. So the one thing that I think that is very similar is that people have been tired, and they are tired then, they were tired now. And you see a bigger influx of the youth. The connection between the youth in the civil rights movement and the youth during the Black Lives Matter movement, you can't not see it. Young people were the heart of the civil rights movement. Most of the things that started with the civil rights movement, the lunch counter protests, the freedom rides, all of these things started with the college students, with the high school students. And you see that happening again with the Black Lives Matter movement. The college students kind of taking the forefront and really saying, this is our America, we're up next. And how can we actively make sure that as we grow, this America is representative of who we want it to become and who we're trying to become as a result of it. So looking at socially, people are tired. People have been tired. They're going to continue to be tired until there's some action taken. I think that's one of the biggest things, I think, socially. And of course, looking at poverty, the poverty levels then and the poverty levels now are about the same, ironically. I'm from a poverty-stricken environment, inner city Memphis, and Memphis had their own battle with Black Lives Matter. And I think that when you look at the similarities with poverty, you'll see that the environments that were poor in 1965 are poor in 2023 and were poor in 2014 as well.
All right, Ms. Wynn, same question.
Okay, I keep hearing us say the civil rights movement, and I always modify by saying the modern civil rights movement. African Americans fought for civil rights almost from the time they entered here. So it's a continuous movement. It's not one that starts and stops. It's continuous. Whether you're talking about the abolitionist movement of the 1800s or the early 1900s, or whether you're talking about, we had freedom rides, we had women refusing to give up seats on trains and buggies. You can think about several different women who had problems with transportation in the 19th century, way before Rosa Parks. And even if you talk about the 20th century, there were women who refused to give up seats before Rosa Parks. Keys is one that comes to mind. Virginia Morgan is another one that comes to mind. There were several people. So to me, if we're talking about the civil rights movement, we're talking about a continuation of a movement. If we're talking about the modern civil rights movement, most historians begin that around 1954. I agree with what Bridget said. Young people have always been at the center of a civil rights movement. Even when you think about some of the earlier higher education cases that was brought by Thurgood Marshall and the Legal Defense Fund, they were cases on college campuses that were brought by young African-American college students trying to gain access to a college education in a segregated system. And certainly when you come to 1954 with the Brown decision, that decision is about young people. Many people don't realize that the Brown decision was a combination of about 6 or 7 cases that dealt with young people trying to gain access to an equitable education, even down to transportation to and from school. We forget that many students prior to 1954 had to walk miles to and from school in order to gain an education. I think I see the Black Lives Movement as a continuation of the civil rights movement. It comes at a different time. And, I think we have to mention those 3 Black women who started the Black Lives Movement, Garza, Coolers, and Tameti. They created what was a Black-centered political will movement, building a project that called Black Lives Matter. And as it was already been stated, it's not, just African Americans in, the middle class, because, if you really stop and think about it, that's what the modern civil rights movement kind of was about. It was about those African Americans. If they were not in the middle class, they were aspiring to be in the middle class. We talk about college students. Who were these students? They were students who were in the middle class or aspiring to middle class status. So, and we must not forget that Black Lives Matter came into existence because of the murder of Trayvon Martin, by George Zimmerman. And so when we look at the breadth and the impact of the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States, it's been extraordinary. If we look at what happened with the murder of George Floyd, for example, that's part of the Black Lives Matter movement. And it didn't just happen in the United States, it was all across the world, where people responded to police brutality. Really, the police murdering, an individual who, they stayed on, Chauvin stayed on his neck for more than 9 minutes. So, I think that when we look at the movement, from my perspective, I think we have to see it as a continuous movement. Coretta Scott King said, freedom is won in every generation. So that means about every 30 years. And if you go back and look, it's almost like every 30 to 40 years that there is a movement among African Americans, because we have not actually gained the full freedom that is enunciated in the governing documents of the United States. And as we said here today on February the 22nd, 2023, we see that rights are being eroded by individuals who, want to claim, wokeism, whatever that means to them. From my perspective, I thought it was always wise to be awakened or awoke to things that were going on in and around you. And so, to try to push aside the contributions of many different people, many different races, many different genders in the United States, to me is the opposite of what a society that is trying to grow and live up to its principles as enunciated in its governing documents.
And if I may, I think that there's also good connection to the rise of the Black Panther Party in the late 1960s as well, when you talk about the modern Black Lives Matter movement. And you can see that especially following the murder of George Floyd, with the Honorable Chairman Fred Hampton created the Rainbow Coalition in Chicago during that time period, which brought together people of various races. And you saw that following the murder of George Floyd, when people across the world were protesting that injustice. And I think that's a great through line as well, looking at the contributions of the Black Panthers and that through line into the Black Lives Matter movement.
Yeah, well, I see the Black Panther movement actually as a continuation of that modern civil rights movement.
Right.
A lot of people tend to separate them out. I separate them out if I'm trying to talk specifically about the Black Panther movement, but it's just another aspect of the modern civil rights movement. And that's the reason I didn't call it out specifically, but I do see it as a continuation of the modern civil rights movement or the civil rights movement in general.
One thing I would say, this is when we started this conversation, because I am amazed at the historical record of how laws are consistently changed in order to remedy situations like this. We've recently seen police brutality with Tyree Nichols in Memphis. Of course, we know George Floyd. We know these things are happening, and there tend to be laws that change. However, I've always felt as though the laws change, but the hearts and minds of the people do not. And that's the reason we keep having to discuss these issues. So everyone that says, you know, as early as 1871, the 41st Congress of this country passed legislation that, well, passed an act that would prohibit you from discriminating against anyone as exercising the right to vote. Now, certain people didn't have the right to vote, but, you know, they were trying to move in that direction. And you start wondering, why are we still having these conversations? And it gets down to how we can adjust the mindset of those people that we interact with or interface with to make them better understand the full Black experience. Now, one of those key issues is public education and public schools. Some of the things we've talked about so far really are looking at the educational process or the history of what is actually taking place in this country. There's a graph that's actually often referred to that shows the years of enslavement. Then it shows, you know, little periods of time, Jim Crow, and there's this really small slice when we are trying to, as Black Americans, see the full range of the rights that we were giving in the founding documents. That is something that people need to understand, the number of years of unequal, of equity that we have to make up in this country in order to fix things. Let's talk about the public education. That history has come under attack. I'll start with you, Dr. Franklin. The history has come under attack. There's a view that teaching the history of this country, I don't hear people saying it's an accurate history. I just hear people saying that it is divisive or somehow going to cause problems to hear the truth. A 2021 law, for instance, in the state of Tennessee, makes it illegal for any public school to teach that people can be privileged based on race. So why do you think these types of curriculum have become so divisive?
Well, it's a good question. And I do want to make one asterisk about the BLM folks, that when you say Black Lives Matter, and it has a spiritual resonance. Think about it, just Black Lives Matter, Black Lives Matter. Go back and think about the enslaved and lynchings in Rosewood and the Cruikshank case that basically green-lighted the slaughter of African Americans. So when you say Black Lives Matter, it matters, it matters, it matters, it matters. It's a spiritual anchor, I think, in addition to a political and movement anchor as well. Well, this attack on education, it's some of it is a wedge issue that's that conservatives and racial conservatives particularly are using to mobilize voters, and it does have traction in state and local elections as well, and it will be used in the future, and it's something that we have to deal with. Some of it is based upon a fear of the Black and browning of America, even in places where that's a slower process. In Tennessee, a new study just came out that stated, I think, by 2040, you're going to have 35% plus Tennesseans that's going to be basically non-white, which is a big deal for Tennessee if you compare it to, say, Louisiana or Florida. And so there's a lot of fear of the Black and browning of America. The racial conservatives have advanced this theory known as the replacement theory, and their argument has been that that they're being replaced by people of color, Blacks and Latinos, and that they themselves are the new underdog. They're the new disenfranchised person on all things. And so their argument is that they are or have to organize against they feel they're being mistreated. It's kind of one of the crazy arguments, but it does have real traction in a lot of conservative circles and in their echo chamber. Some of it is a push against federal intervention and the U.S. Department of Education and other federal officials that may want to advance diversity programs. So there's a combination of reasons as to why you have this attack on diversity or critical race theory, even though many of them have never read anything about critical race theory. Yeah, so it's something that we have to contend with. At some point in time in Tennessee, I think we have to stand up to that system of oppression. We have to stand up to that attack. And where I would like to see is a more united front among college professors and educators at the high school, junior high, and elementary level, in order to respond to this attack on so-called diversity-based programs.
All right, I'll go to you, Ms. Jones. Same question. Why do you feel as though teaching Black history has become so divisive?
Well, I don't think it's become divisive. I think it's been divisive. I think that when you start talking about the fullness of the Black experience, to be clear, I think that white America has always been able to live in a bubble that is comfortable and suitable for their interpretation of what the American dream may or may not be. And when you start talking about the fact that that American dream has not always been equitable for everybody that lives in America, then you start debating the foundations of America. All history does is hold up a mirror and allow you to see yourself and your ancestors. So when you start holding up a mirror of fact and saying, well, my experience in America has not been so great, and then you have to say, well, why is that? And now we have to talk about legacy and ancestry. And people have to say, well, maybe my ancestors weren't so great to your ancestors, but what does that then say about you as a person? And that's what a lot of people don't want to do. I work in public history. I work at a former plantation. I see this all the time when people come through the door and they're given the option to either take a tour that's going to give more of the history of the Harding Jackson family versus taking a tour that's going to be specific and solely about enslavement. Oh no, I'm on vacation. I don't want to be uncomfortable. I'm not trying to talk about slavery on my good vacation. So I think that nowadays what you're seeing is that a lot of conservatives are taking a hard stance and saying, I don't want my kids to feel bad. It's really not the children. You as a grown adult don't want to feel bad. I think that's the bigger issue. It's grown adults who have never had to deal with their history straightforward and typically don't know enough Black people or have been around enough Black people to tell them the God honest truth about what the experience of America actually is.
Okay, Ms. Wynn.
You're muted.
Sorry. Like Bridget, I'm in public history and have been in public history for more decades than I'd like to admit. And I can remember having conversations with several historic sites about the interpretation of the African-American experience or the experience of the enslaved. During that time, some felt they were very uncomfortable because they didn't want African-American visitors to feel uncomfortable. So, we have gone through an evolvement in terms of putting that heritage out there about the African-American experience at historic sites like the Hermitage, Belle, Meade, Rock Castle, Carrington Plantation, and several other sites. I've worked with some sites, Travelers Rest in particular, on dealing with the African-American heritage. But, when I think about the 2021 law, my mind goes back to the 1980s. I remember when the census were projecting that whites were going to be in a minority. We've known that since at least the 80s. I look at the election of Barack Obama. I think you can almost, and I'm not a political scientist, Sekou, so, but I think you can look at the the election of Barack Obama, and there's a straight line to where all of a sudden there is a problem with teaching the African American experience. These people don't want, I used to tell my students, I lift African American history out of American history. You can't have one without the other. You can't have American history without African American or women or, some of the other groups that are contained within that American experience. You look at the election of Barack Obama, you look at George Floyd, how many whites worldwide, not only in this nation, came out in response to what happened to George Floyd up until this moment. And as Bridget said, it's not the children that they are worried about. They are worried about themselves. What I or my ancestors may have done. We have never said we're blaming you in the present generation. We just want you to acknowledge that this is a part of the American story. Yes, it's uncomfortable, but unfortunately, sometimes history is uncomfortable. So we have to look at and be prepared to talk about African American history within the context of state history, city history, national history, international history. Because, when you look at that modern civil rights movement, King didn't just stay in the United States. He was traveling abroad. And, if you look at some of the countries in Africa, they are having this movement about the same time we are. There is a connectivity. It's important that we teach African American history, and I think public history is going to become more important because as they say what you can say and not say in the classroom, you can take this to the public history arena. And if I'm at Belle Meade, Bridget, you can talk about that African American experience of being enslaved and tell that whole story in the public history arena. And unfortunately, from all of the years that I've been in public history, there are not a whole lot of us in public history in Tennessee. There are only a few of us. So it's someone asked me, why have I stayed at the commission so long? That's part of the reason. Mm-hmm. That's part of the reason, because if I'm not there to help tell that story and to nudge people in, we need to look at this aspect of this particular site's history. Who's going to do it? Because there aren't many of us. And it's important that we all know, regardless of race or ethnicity, the history of those who make up this state, this city, this nation. I sit on the Metro Historical Commission. We just did a marker for the Kurdish community. Mm-hmm. So it's important that all of the people who are citizens, again, of this city, state, and nation, and indeed internationally, that we know our different stories. Yeah. I think, when we know the story in its totality, hopefully the better citizens we become.
I would agree. Now, in this conversation, we've talked about, there's all sorts of federal legislation. We've talked some about the global movement, the civil rights movement, Black Lives Matter. We've talked about the very national issue of Black history. Let's move this closer to home. One of the things in being in this position at the YWCA I felt was important was highlighting our own history at the YWCA. We were fortunate that we were able to get a historic marker, thank you, Ms. Wynn, for the Blue Triangle Room. The Blue Triangle was the segregated YW. We've been in Nashville 125 years. So we've gone through two separate YWs, one Black, one white. The Blue Triangle, however, in my viewpoint, had been marginalized because they were swept up in the majority, YW at the time. But we were able to get that historic marker near Fisk University to really let people understand our legacy. And there were so many people that told me they had never heard the Blue Triangle. They had never knew that we had a separate African-American YW, and we were the largest one in the South. And so it's pretty significant. So let's get down to Nashville. Let's discuss the I-40 construction through Jefferson Street in North Nashville and what effect that had on African-American businesses. What were the city planners trying to do? How does that affect the Nashville that we know today? I'll start with you, Dr. Franklin.
Well, Professor Wynn probably knows a lot more about this because I think she probably lived through this. But again, to make Nashville a local story that's connected to a larger story, you had these highway construction projects taking place all over the country at a time in which you had the expansion of highways. Many of your people in the audience know that this occurred during the Eisenhower years, where the federal highway expansion. So you saw communities such as Nashville, North Nashville, the South Bronx, for example, parts of Memphis, and it produced a series of revolts, including in Nashville, called the quote unquote freeway revolt, so to speak. And for Nashville, what this meant was not only the continued the displacement of African Americans from their communities. You saw the displacement of African Americans that were, some of whom were relatively thriving by the standards of that period of time. Not everyone, but relatively thriving. The loss of dozens of African American businesses in North Nashville, and what I think it did was, from my perspective, beyond just the direct impact for Nashville in particular, is it set the standard for how land use decisions can be made in Nashville. And in the case of the I-40 project, it was challenged in court. In fact, Z. Alexander Luby and others challenged it in court. It made its way to the appellate circuit, Sixth Circuit Appellate Circuit, and the appellate circuit basically ruled that the decision had been made sometime in the late 1950s, I believe, in a meeting or a series of meetings, and thus there was nothing they could do about it. And what it really speaks to is how land use decisions in Nashville, and even to this day, are shaped by oftentimes a kind of invisible group of unregulated realtors, investors, economic development specialists, sometimes with the consent of elected officials, sometimes without the consent of elected officials, and sometimes those folks are pushing elected officials. And so for me, what it does, if you look at North Nashville today, and you find that East Nashville has been severely gentrified, displaced, South Nashville is almost gone, and then North Nashville now, significant parts of North Nashville are being gentrified. Not all of it is caused by so-called land use decisions, but there are critical land use decisions that are taking this, using the same playbook that was used in the I-40 construction project. The difference being, though, is that there are some African Americans that are part of that playbook now. Okay, okay, and a critical part of it. But what it really speaks to is, again, is for me, in terms of land use issues, is how an elite group of actors can really shape land use decisions for African Americans, and then that puts African Americans in almost a permanent or irreversible state in terms of the community of decline, or at least it makes it very difficult to reverse those decisions that happen during the I-40 construction project.
Yes, that's an attack economically, politically, and socially. So when you get that trifecta, when you get all three of those, it's very difficult for marginalized people to overcome that. I'll go to you, Ms. Jones.
Everything that Dr. Franklin said is absolutely right. I think one of the things that it also did is affect North Nashville socially. A lot of North Nashville was a community, it was a hub. At one point in time, there was Black doctors and Black professionals, Black attorneys, all living in that same area. And when you went through that area, it displaced those individuals. They had to go live elsewhere. And before you know it, you see the decline of a neighborhood that was once a premier residential area for Black Nashvillians. I participated in a docu-series called Facing North that was about North Nashville, and another person that was interviewed said that he felt that desegregation was the worst thing that could have happened to North Nashville. And his foundation for that belief is that when you took away those very important pillars of North Nashville, you took away the positive images of Blackness. You took away Black wealth, you took away Black intellectualism, and all that was left were the people who may not have had the same ladder as other people, but you took away their representation, because representation matters. And when you no longer have people around you on a daily basis for you to look at and say, I can achieve that, I can be that, I can do what they have done, and actually go to these people and ask, how can you help me? How can I do what you've done and walk in your footsteps? Now you just leave people lost. It took away the businesses and the economic growth. That community pulled itself up by its own bootstraps. The vast majority of the enslaved at Belle Meade will migrate to North Nashville following emancipation. That area was integral to the development of a Black community. And when they put that interstate there, they knew exactly what they were doing. And they, quite frankly, did not care. Absolutely did not care.
All right, Ms. Wynn.
Okay, I think that, when we look at I-40, I think we have to go back maybe to the 1930s and look at the Wagner-Deagle Act, which authorized the federal government to subsidize housing undertaken by local public housing authorities. And you have to look at the act of 1949 that extended those subsidies to cover urban renewal. Basically, when you look at urban renewal, it is just an extension of what had taken place starting in the 1930s. You had the Federal Highway Act that comes into play around 1956. And so that's going to have a detrimental effect. One thing that people don't often talk about with I-40 and going through North Nashville is that it was originally supposed to go over by Vanderbilt. Okay, and people, the powers that be, and let's just say the Chamber of Commerce was involved quite a bit, and the powers that be decided, oh no, this can't happen. So they changed the way the route was going to go to impact North Nashville. They would put up signs in the white areas about when meetings were going to take place about I-40, but they wouldn't even put the correct dates on there. So if you were Black and you went to a white drugstore or wherever it may be, they had the wrong date there. So it was very intentional in terms of what they did. I-40 completely decimated North Nashville as far as I'm concerned. But I do want to throw in a caveat. In the 1950s, you had certain Blacks beginning to move out of North Nashville and move to places like the Gold Coast. The Gold Coast was established by Carsey Gardner, and Carsey Gardner was influential funeral home director. He developed the Gold Coast. So you had people moving out of North Nashville around about the same time that this is beginning, when the Federal Highway Act comes in 1956. People that moved into that area were people like Dr. Matthew Walker, Dr. A.P. Johnson, Dr. Anderson, Dr. Perry. You had several business people that were in that particular neighborhood. So they had began, to move out. Bridget, I sort of agree with what you said. Desegregation probably was the worst thing that could have happened. I used to tell my students that I wouldn't take anything from my segregated education because we had teachers that made you perform, from the brightest to the not so bright. They made you perform. So there was a connection in the community between the students. When I went to Pearl High School, Dr. Hull was the principal. He knew not only my mother and father, he knew my grandmother, he knew my aunts. He knew everybody, and that's on both sides of the family. So there was no way that I was going to get out of control, because I know J.C. Hull, as we used to call him, he was going to pick up the phone and call somebody in my family. It was, a community like that helped to educate. Many of the teachers that taught at Pearl were at Fisk University. Some were at Tennessee State, graduates of Tennessee State University. So it was a community. We went to church with those, with some of our teachers, both on the secondary level and on the collegiate level. But when they deliberately destroyed or decimated Jefferson Street, they understood, I think, better than perhaps the African American understood, the cohesiveness of that community. And if you take certain elements of it out, there's not going to be, you're going to limit the growth of an up and coming middle class. You're only going to leave certain people in that area. And, when the schools changed and became desegregated, I don't know about you all, but, when I was growing up, Pearl High was almost the center of the community. And it was probably like that in Memphis. There was a certain school that was the center of the community, where everybody gathered regardless of race or regardless of class. And it was an, inspiration. Teachers, like I said, made the good students better, and they made the not so good students achieve up to their ability. When you think about what was lost out of Jefferson area, I think there was something like 620 Black homes were lost.
Mhm.
You had 6 Black churches that were demolished. There were about 50 streets that were dead ended. So I thought it was a bitter pill to swallow. I think last year, the year before, there was conversations about a cap to reconnect streets. I sat on a committee when they did the Causey Gardner Park. And my comment was, you can't be doing this for the residents that are there, because that area is becoming so gentrified. You're doing it for the people who are coming in, not for the people who are already there. They, those who have generational lineage in that area who are still there, they know who Causey Gardner was.
Mhm.
It's for people who are coming into the area. And to me, it's just a way of trying to make the general gentrification pill look not as bitter.
Yes, thank you.
Unless you realize the whole history of the reason I-40 is where it is and what it did to that community. And I think it's going to be imperative that we continue to watch, because there's still conversations going on about how to connect these streets that were disconnected. And again, that's not necessarily for the benefit of African Americans. That's for the benefit of the gentrified community.
Now, Dr. Franklin, earlier you spoke about how things have changed somewhat. We've got a really great historical perspective, but we are where we are. Love your sign. Voting does matter. Voting on demand. We need to be able to vote. But give us a feel for where we go now. What's next? What can we do given the place, the state where we are in Nashville, given the movement in the neighborhoods? And we do have African Americans that are at the table more than they were historically. Where do we go from here in this conversation?
Well, still, I would, if I were in the 1960s, I'd probably answer the same thing. It's still going to require resistance, critical resistance on the ground, organizing, and when I say resistance, I'm not just talking about protest in the classic sense, but resistance writ large, whether that means building out citizenship schools like September Clark and others did, that can educate the community about these things. In the world of nonviolence, we refer to that as constructive programs. Having a real what today we would call intersectional approach, but really looking at how, going back to the 60s, how voting rights relates to food security as Fannie Hamer and as Mayor Edelman, and really anchoring these kinds of movements in community-centered, people-centered kind of movements as well, and really finding a way in which through our organizations we can lean on the collective wisdom of our elders, but also lean on the collective wisdom and the spirit of our ancestors to find the courage, quite frankly. Because I've been involved in quite a bit of stuff. It was right there, Black Lives Matter, policing issues. And it does take a lot of courage to get out there. And it does take not just courage to face off against, white supremacy and racism, but the ostracism even by some of your own, African-American leadership, frankly, but also the courage to deal with your family dynamics of I'm taking time away from family and there's family politics you're dealing with. So I think collectively dealing with that, and really, I think my last comment I want to say is, I think for people that are out there, if you can just identify one issue or two issues and struggle around those issues, right? And my hope is that those issues deal most acutely with those persons that are as Howard Thurman said, who have their backs against the wall at this given point in time.
All right, Ms. Jones, where do we go from here? What are our next steps?
I am a big believer in Sankofa. I think that it is imperative that we continue to look back to be able to move forward. I think continuing to educate ourselves on the foundations of this country. I think Black people should be absolutely positively familiar with the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. I think that if anybody should be familiar with those documents, we should know them like the back of our hand so that we can always argue our fair piece. And as Dr. Franklin said, always remembering to honor the ancestors in the work that we do and look to them for methods of change, because the work that was started during Reconstruction was continued by the work of the early and mid 1960s Jim Crow and civil rights movement. I think that we're still seeing that work being continued today, as Professor Wynn said. So I think, continuing to look back and to move forward and remembering that the work is not finished. We're still essentially just getting started.
Hey, Professor Wynn, where do we go from here?
I think where we go from here, one of my pet peeves about us and voting, we register people to vote. We will get them to the polls to vote, and that's where we stop. We don't follow through on the process, and the process includes knowing what the people you put into office, how are they voting on specific bills? Are they voting the values of a lobbyist, or are they voting your values? We don't follow through. We don't I go to some council meetings, you know, we'll be there if it's something in particular, but I'm talking about just generally following bills. I'm legislative liaison from my office when I used to go up to the Cordell Hull building quite a bit. I see us on sorority days, fraternity days, and church days. I don't see us following an education committee. I don't see us following government ops. I don't see us following budget finance, be it House or Senate. How are the people voting that you put in? How are we holding them accountable? And to my way of thinking, we're not. We put them in, we don't see them until the next 2, 4, or 6 years. And then we turn right around and we put them back in again. And I'm not sure we know how they voted on anything. I'm not even sure we know what bills there were up there for them to vote on. And it's so easy now. You can tune into, you know, committee hearings at the state legislature by just going to the website. How are we following what our representatives on the local, state, or national level are doing? And to my way of thinking, we're not. And I think that's where part of the failure comes in. You know, right now, Tennessee State is under assault legislatively. What are we doing? You know, we talking about bills that deal with what can and cannot be taught. What are we doing? I just think, you know, we're only involved in part of the process, not the process in its totality. And I think that is an important aspect in which we need to be involved. And that's coming from my public administration background.
All right. Very quickly, but I think this is very important. This work is difficult. I'd be the first to say that. It seems regular course of business. When we started these lunch and learns a number of years ago, when I became the CEO of the YW, it was not business as usual for this organization. And I thank each of you for participating. But what motivates you and sustains the work that you do? What gets you up in the morning and makes you take on these challenges? I'll start with you again, Dr. Franklin.
Oh, for me, it's personal. I think about how fortunate I've been, and I feel like I owe the world much more than what it owes me. There's been times in which I was able to be part of a group that met with Reverend James Lawson to get trained by him for the greater part of 3.5 years, and been in the room with Bob Moses from the Bay Area, so some Black Panthers. And there's no way in the world I would have thought at 21 years old that I would have had a chance to have these kind of interactions. So thinking about how fortunate I am, and then also, you know, what I owe. I think intergenerational leadership is important. It's one of the underestimated, undervalued aspects. And thinking about the people that I've learned from, the ancestors who's also paved the way as well. Those are the kind of things that motivates me and constantly keeps me going. And at the same time, I'm also trying to make sure on a daily basis that I uphold my integrity. It's a daily struggle. And that humility, and that I'm just not that I'm always there to show up to fight if I can. And if I could muster up the energy for that, then I think that I can at least make a small contribution.
Thank you. Okay, Ms. Jones. What
Uh,
keeps you motivated?
Yeah, again, a big fan of Sankofa. So looking backwards, I'm the descendant of enslaved Tennesseans. My family hails from Grand Junction, Tennessee, on the Ames Plantation. So my ancestors absolutely keeps me motivated. But looking forward to the future, my son keeps me sustained because I want to make sure that this place and this history is always represented. He is a little Black boy with locks living in the South, and it's still somewhat segregated in its own way. And I want to make sure that the world where he can be proud of not only his skin color, but it makes him special to be in this world. So my ancestors and my future.
All right, Professor Wynn.
I just want to make sure that people, regardless of race, know the history and the contributions that all of us have made to making this country what it is, specifically on the local and state level. There are 95 counties in Tennessee, and some of those counties have not recognized the contributions of other people, and that's inclusive of women. So, you know, I sort of see myself, especially in my position as assistant director, as one who is trying to make sure that the history of women and people of all races are, that history is shared among all people. And I think that once we know the collective history, then we hopefully would move on for a better state and certainly a better nation.
Yes. Well, thank you so much. Thanks to this wonderful and informative panel. We don't have time today to go into details on the questions. One question to keep in mind that you can follow up later is the issue of changing the representation of the community by decreasing the number of individuals on the Metro Council, which is a significant Nashville issue. But thank you for participating today in the Stand Against Injustice Lunch and Learn, celebrating Nashville's Black community. So thank you very much.
Thank you.